Thank you everyone for joining us. It's really lovely to have you here during this IFF ConnectCast webinar today. So my name is Sula Luchin and I am one of the learning consultants here at IFF Training. So today I'm here to host this webinar, which is focusing on anti-money laundering, sanctions and ESG topics. So Mark Anderson is our subject matter expert here, and he's going to be giving you an insight and his views on these hot pressing topics that we're facing at the moment in the world of banking and within financial institutions.
You're very welcome. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. As we said, welcome along to our webinar. And we're going to look at three separate topics. We're going to start at anti-money laundering, what's going on in the world of anti-money laundering, who's doing what to who in anti-money laundering, and how we're going to cope with it. And I want to show you some of the hot topics that are going on within money laundering, etc. right now. So you all know about money laundering and how it works, etc. So I'm not going, I seem to be at the wrong end of my presentation, so I apologize for that. We'll go right back to the start. Here we go.
No worries at all.
Money laundering is one of the world's biggest industries. In fact, after trade finance and international trade, it is possibly the biggest industry in the world. And a lot of people think that what has happened is it's gone away because of the pandemic, and it hasn't. It's changed. So we see estimates of what organized crime and money laundering is worth. The estimates from the UN are a little out of date now. I reckon it's somewhere around 7 trillion a year. The point is, we just don't know. And we have no way of knowing. And you'll see that as we go through. I'm not going to read every single slide to you, but I want to sort of give you some thematic ideas as we go through. And if you think to yourself, what percentage of laundered money do you think we find and we confiscate? Just think of a number in your head right now. And then compare it to what the professionals think. So according to the CEO of Standard Chartered, the recent CEO of Standard Chartered, less than 1% is found and confiscated. So you could argue from that particularly within the financial sector, we're not very good at spotting it. And I'm not sure I would disagree with that, but we're a lot better than other sectors. And one of the themes that I want to go through today with you is simply that the money launderers are clever people. And what we tend to forget is for them, it's a business too. And the better they are at their business, the more they will succeed, the richer they'll be, and the less time they'll spend in prison. And so it's not just about financial institutions, it's about all those other people. It's about the law firms, it's about the accountants, it's about the trust providers, it's about the money service bureaus, it's about the luxury goods dealers, it's about luxury car sellers and wholesalers, etc. And we've discovered in the last few years that just about anything can be laundered. And I've given you some examples here that I've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. I've seen Vera Wang dresses. I've seen Jimmy Choo shoes. I've seen Rolexes. I've seen smartphones of different types. Obviously, things like Xboxes. I saw an example with tires. High-end tires for high-end cars. Refrigerators and white goods. Computers, cars, of course. I saw an example of frozen raspberries. It was actually a frozen yogurt retailer who was laundering money on behalf of a sanctioned third party. So just about everything can be laundered, but at some point in the process, there'll be a bank. At some point in the process, there's probably going to be a lawyer. There's probably going to be an accountancy firm. There may be an insurance company. Increasingly, we believe there may be an asset manager. And in thematic terms, one of the things I want to point out here is that the FBI have said that they are looking at asset managers, private equity firms, and hedge funds in terms of money laundering, because they believe that they haven't been looked at enough. They think while all the focus has been on the banks, that some of these other organizations may well have been laundering money. And one of the things you can expect to see in the next couple of years is more high-profile investigations into other types of financial institution. Last year, we saw a big drop in AML fines, and that was largely because the regulators weren't focusing enough through the pandemic on the fines. And you can understand that. Warren Buffett, the world's most famous investor, has a great saying, when the tide goes out, we see who's swimming without shorts. And right now, the tide's going out. So we at IFF find we're being asked for courses by people sometimes who have discovered that their, how should we say, their policies and procedures during the pandemic, during lockdowns, when people were perhaps working from home, maybe weren't kept to in the way that it was expected they would have been kept to. That's putting it quite politely, but I think you know what I mean. And so more and more financial institutions are discovering issues from the pandemic and more precisely from people working from home. We're also finding more and more examples of these wonderful people. They're called the professional money launderers or the professional enablers. And this could be an organization who will take your dirty money and launder it for you for a fee, and they'll give you clean money at the other end. And the most we have found these people charging is 80%. So if you want to launder $10 million, it'll cost you $8 million. And when we talk about this in face-to-face courses, you can almost hear this sort of intake of breath, 80%. And I always say, well, what would you rather have? $6 million with lots of risk or $2 million with no risk? And I know what I would rather have. So these people are out there, and they could be lawyers, they could be accountants, trust company service providers, they could be MSBs, they could be anything. They could be charity, they could be pizza chains, you name it. They could have been operating for 50 or 60 years without people asking too many questions. So there's been a focus on these professional money launderers, and also a focus on amateur money launderers and inadvertent money launderers. And we've seen even in the UK, a couple of very well-known law firms have paid fines because they weren't doing proper due diligence on their clients, and they inadvertently laundered money on behalf of those clients. We've seen an upsurge in people trafficking. According to the International Labour Organization, $150 billion of profits every year. That money has to go somewhere. Where is it going? Well, it's going through banks. It's going through charities into banks. It's going through NGOs. It's slushing around in the system. Every boat that comes from France to England with immigrants is worth about £38,000, so 42,000 euros to the people traffickers. And that's a lot for an inflatable bit of rubber, a cheap engine, a few life jackets, and a couple of paddles. You can see the extent of the money they are making. There's been a concentration in money laundering terms on environmental crime. The Financial Actions Task Force estimate that the value of environmental crimes is about 260 billion a year. And that's mostly from dumping of hazardous waste. And this is increased because of all those masks. I don't know what it's like if you think where you are, but everywhere here, there are discarded masks. And they're all being dumped either legitimately in landfill, or where they can recycle them, or sent overseas to be dumped. So environmental crimes is something that the regulators are insisting that financial institutions look at, and there are all sorts of recommendations about what financial institutions should do in terms of environmental crimes. Been a huge uptick in crime, mostly fraud, during the pandemic. But again, fraud raises money that needs to be laundered, whether it's government aid fraud, whether we've seen a lot of fake charities. We've also seen a lot of people saying, well, I can produce this medical good and that medical good and this serum and this vaccine and all the rest of it all being absolute rubbish. And of course, there's been a huge uptick in cybercrime. One thing that people have kind of forgotten about, but it is now coming to the fore again, is terrorist financing. And where it wasn't a priority during the height, if you like, of the pandemic, more and more people are looking at it now. We're seeing an uptick in requests for courses on terrorist financing, how to prevent it, how to stop it, how to spot it. And again, it's coming because the tide has gone out and people are seeing what they did and who they did it with during the pandemic. I thought I'd show you a few interesting ways of laundering money. We've only been talking for 10 minutes, but the reality is there'll be lots of new money laundering schemes out there while we've been talking. But a few interesting ones. Churches. We've discovered churches are great because churches normally have charitable status. They also have tax advantages, plus they have a lumpy income. So for a Christian church, you will have bulges in income around Easter, probably at Christmas, the major festivals of the church, but also in the summer when you have lots of weddings. And we've discovered that in the southern states of America and in Latin America, churches have been used to launder money. And when you think about it, it's pretty perfect, isn't it? A pretty perfect and a good way of doing it. We've also seen the rise of the money mule. And money mules had kind of gone out of fashion a little bit pre-pandemic, but during the pandemic, they came back into fashion. This was a lady who was stopped at Heathrow Airport flying to Dubai with about $2.5 million in her suitcases. She was putting them into the hold. And she said she was taking them to Dubai for a friend. And it transpired that what she was doing was working for a gang of drug dealers who couldn't find a bank who was willing to transfer money for them. And so they just said, well, look, you go on a holiday to Dubai and take these with you. And because it was in the middle of the pandemic, there were so few people flying that Heathrow was able to look and scan every single bag and look at it closely. So they found her. She's now in prison. So money mules is a theme that we've seen over the last couple of years. Also football. You know, we have a World Cup coming up in Qatar in November, December, and there's a lot of football clubs out there being investigated. If you think about it, you've got the players, you've got their contracts, money's being paid to agents, there are image rights, there are all sorts of other things going on financially, and making sure that the larger football clubs who are turning over lots of money are keeping it clean, as it were, is a full-time job for some regulators. And I could, if we had time, we look at this in courses, show you lots of football clubs that have been used by money launderers and just left as shells, if you like. So football clubs are great for laundering money. If I was a criminal, that's what I'd be doing. Horse racing. Finally, the authorities have woken up to the possibility of laundering money through thoroughbred racehorses. Because when you think about it, a thoroughbred racehorse is worth whatever the two parties think it is. And again, I could give you lots of examples of rather ordinary horses, shall we say, being sold for large sums of money to offshore syndicates. We've discovered in the UK, and we like to pontificate here in the UK about money laundering, but we've discovered in the UK that universities have been allowing overseas students to come with big bags of cash and pay for their tuition and board and lodging. Go figure. Shouldn't happen. It's not allowed. And yet many universities in the UK have been doing this. We've seen people using the Amazon self-publishing app where you can publish your own book and let people buy them. We've seen criminal gangs putting books on there, My 30 Minutes with Mark or whatever it happens to be, and putting it on for outrageous sums, and of course people buying it. But the people who are buying it are the other members of the gang. And what they're really doing is layering the money. They're moving it around to try and obscure where it came from. there is no book. It's just money launderers. They've also been doing the same thing with Airbnb, where there may or may not be a property. The property website may have been hacked. It may just be a picture of a property, Central Park in the Dakota building or wherever. And they are using that, again, as a way of layering money through the system. And one of the most egregious and biggest thing, I mean, yes, we've had the Danske Bank Estonian thing, but this was, even more egregious. I think this is NatWest last year. It turned out that they'd taken on a jewelers as a customer, and they projected, when they did their due diligence and their KYC, they projected that the turnover would be around 15 million a year. What happened was, in 5 years, they deposited 365 million, sometimes with 1.8 million per day. And most of this was in cash. So you had the spectacle of people with black bags going into the bank and handing it over. They've been caught, they've been fined, etc. There was a huge row about it. And the failings went all the way through the bank. And when we talk to people about this, we always talk about this wonderful thing called the smell test. And the smell test is known by the regulators as professional skepticism. And that is that your artificial intelligence and your systems are not going to pick everything up. You still rely on your first line of defense, those people sitting, taking money, those people who are seeing clients, etc. You still rely on them to go above and beyond your policies and procedures. We run a course on this, but ticking the box is just the beginning. It's the minimum people should be doing. And at NatWest, they thought it was the maximum. So that was a big example and really puts us to shame. AMRO, they've been fined as well, so it's not just limited to us. There are a number of European banks and a number of American banks who have been fined in recent times for money laundering infractions. And there are lots more who are being investigated by the regulators. Sanctions, of course, is a very big topic, obviously because of the Russia-Ukraine situation. And sanctions can be misunderstood. And that's partly because they've been tagged onto something else. I'm just going to sort of briefly mention the different types of people and things that can be sanctioned, from whole countries like North Korea through to individuals, to airports, ports, ships, etc. But in recent times, the smart sanction regime, which is what is being used on Russia by the Western governments at the minute, has been attached to what we call proliferation financing. And proliferation financing is trying to stop the financing, movement, or creation of anything that could be turned into a weapon, particularly a weapon of mass destruction. And again, just post the first lockdown, a set of recommendations was brought up by some of the regulators and some of the international bodies about what to do about proliferation financing. And there's an example I always give of a guy he lives about 10 miles away from here, who was making little mechanical parts in his, he had a little business, it operated out of a shed at the bottom of the garden, and he was making these little parts. He thought he was making them for the oil fields in Azerbaijan. What was actually happening was they were being shipped from Azerbaijan to Iran and used in weapons of mass destruction. And so he was fined and put in prison. And that was because Iran was sanctioned, of course, but also this came under proliferation financing. So anything to do with weapons of mass destruction. And he was caught because of this thing we call extraterritorial jurisdiction. And this is the idea that the US, because of the dollar, and because many of our financial institutions, etc., have operations in the US, correspondent accounts, are doing business there, are caught by this. And there have been a number of court cases recently where American courts have reinforced this extraterritorial jurisdiction. It's something that not everybody likes, but we are seeing more and more of it. And what we've seen, because of the US and the heaviness of their fines in sanctions, is that a number of the criminals have been skipping the US totally to start with and coming to Europe. They've been coming to Spain, Switzerland, Luxembourg in order to put their ill-gotten gains in the system. And you may have seen, it's a shame I haven't got a photo of it, it's a great thing. You may have seen these little submarines that have been coming out of Latin America, laden down with cocaine and taking money back, or else the money will be credited in a bank in Europe to the account of the criminals. And very slick little things, these submarines, and it's worth Googling to have a look at. They're called narco subs. So have a look. And the criminals are starting to avoid the US where they can, and they think Europe is a bit of a softer touch. Within Europe, of course, we have a proposed new European AML organization. They're still arguing about where to put it. I see that Italy is the latest country to throw its hat into the ring to host this. And we've seen a number of moves in regulatory terms to tighten regulations. And the big regulations they're all tightening are on ultimate beneficial ownership and control. So they're all looking at this. They're all looking at these offshore corporations, from the leaks from the Pandora Papers, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, etc. And they're looking at that, and everybody's trying to crack down on offshore structures, whether they be companies, whether they be foundations, whether they be charities, whatever it happens to be. Everybody is doing remediation and looking at that stuff. The key sanctions battleground in the world remains Middle East, North Africa. And it's worth pointing out here the proxy countries, which are countries that act as a front, knowingly or unknowingly, for sanctioned countries. And so Lebanon for Syria, for example, Lebanon also for Iran in certain cases. It used to be Venezuela for Cuba, but now there's been something of a change there. But there's always a proxy country somewhere, and knowing who they are and how they operate. And again, the smell test of something going through, let us say, Azerbaijan, which has no real connection to Azerbaijan, should raise some questions and some issues internally with people. Technology for sanctions has its limits. On the left-hand side here, as you look at it, that's Cuba Gooding Jr., who has talked on numerous occasions on his inability to access financial services properly under his real name, and you can kind of understand why. And I'm told that the most common name in the Islamic world is, and therefore you can see that with millions and millions of Khans, technology does have its limits. And again, we go back to this idea sometimes of the smell test. There will be more sanctions on Russian entities, people who are perceived as facilitators. And it's a question of keeping up, but also trying to look behind for a financial institution, look behind the person who's sanctioned, look at their connections, look at who they may really be acting for. And again, that's something that we've started to be asked a lot about. Finally, another hot topic is environmental, social, and governance. And many organizations we deal with don't quite know where to put this. Do you put it in compliance? Is it really an operational thing? So does it come under the operations department? Just where do you put ESG? So environmental, how is a company a steward of nature? Social, how does it interact and manage its relationships with employees, suppliers, customers, those communities where it operates? And governance, so we're looking at the leadership of the company, the board of directors, how are they paid, who's managing that, what are the internal controls, how do they behave in terms of the owners of the company, their shareholders. There are various estimates of the cost of climate change, but The Economist reckons about $4.2 trillion So in environmental change, it's a big number, and it's driving ESG investing. And we think, or the last time I looked, there was about $30 trillion invested in so-called green or ESG funds. So it's a big area, and it's a growing area that banks, asset managers, lawyers, other people in the marketplace need to be cognizant of. And there are lots of, I'm not going to, you can look at the question at the top and see if you can work out an answer to that. The answer is the second one. And in terms of greenhouse gases, the thing that produces most is the clothes you're wearing, because they have to come from somewhere, and there will be a lot of greenhouse gases in those clothes. The biggest, if you like, or the most comprehensive ESG rules in the world are the European rules. And it sometimes feels like they built a big factory outside Brussels, and all the factory does is produce acronyms. Because if you go down the ESG rules for Europe, it is acronym after acronym. And learning them all, recognizing them all, can be quite difficult. We also have other people passing laws. This is the German Due Diligence Act. You can see the name there in German at the top, just so you know. That gets you an awful lot of points at Scrabble, that name. And basically, this is the Supply Chain Act. So you're looking, every company has to look through its supply chain to see if there are ESG issues relating, for example, to human slavery. And that's a big change, because we've known for a while that the weakest link is always somewhere in the supply chain. You may be the cleanest, the most stable, the most environmentally friendly, etc. company, but if someone in your supply chain is not, it ruins it all for you. So this is the easy way to think of it, is the Supply Chain Act. More and more companies are engaging, particularly asset managers are engaging in order to try and change things. I've given you some examples here. Smurfit Kappa, for example, the board is now 25% female. A couple of other bits of issues with ESG. One is the lack of a set of proper ESG standards. So there are so many different standards and so many different bits of data in terms of ESG that most people are picking what they want and saying, yeah, we adhere to that, we're brilliant. Or they're greenwashing. And this is where you're trying to indicate that you are terribly good and nice, but you may not be. And sort of a good example of that, some of you will remember the green Coke, those bottles that were green, Coca-Cola, and Coke was saying we do this, but it was really just greenwashing. I saw a stat the other day, it was something like 400 major brands around the world have been changing their packaging to green and blue. And apparently green and blue makes us think as consumers that these people are environmentally friendly, they're good with the local communities, all that kind of stuff. And local communities, I saw as well, have been inventing their own little sort of marks, little brands that companies can put on their packaging to say, yes, they've helped us here. I saw one which said that it had a picture of a whale, and you might think, oh, that's fantastic. But actually what it had done was it had helped clean up some water off one of the Pacific Islands. It was just a small bay, something like that. And it was a place where whales may or may not go during the year. But what they were hoping was by cleaning it up, the whales would come back. So it was kind of, a little bit stale, really. There are plans afoot to bring all the data together and have a set of standards that is accepted by everyone around the world. We shall see. We also have sport washing, and examples of sport washing might well be, for example, if a foreign nation buys a football club, it could be that they are trying to get into a particular sport which would lead them to be being viewed in a good light. And so everybody's looking at sport washing and what can be done about that, etc. And lastly, with ESG, it's a bit of a whiz through, I know, is Ukraine, of course, because the temptation, you may have heard it on the news or the radio, Germany is talking about more coal. In the UK, we have a new coal mine, which may or may not be given the go-ahead to open. So in a situation where we need energy in the West, do we ignore ESG? Do we say, no, we're not going to ignore it, but we're not actually going to enforce it or do anything about it? And it's a big thing that everybody's thinking about right now. But the EU rules are out there. The rules in the other countries are out there. More and more funds are being managed on an ESG basis. More and more companies are making ESG disclosures as they go along. And as I say, over 30 trillion now managed. And there are indications that those ESG funds outperform, at least they have the last few years. And so it's a trend that's going to continue. Well, that's 35 minutes from me, ladies and gents. That's the end. So Sulla is going to come back in. I think they're going to put a barcode up for you to scan, etc.
Thank you, Mark. That was very insightful. It was excellent. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time on this. Yeah, so as Mark mentioned, what we're going to do is we're going to kick off with our Q&A. So please feel free to post your questions on the chat box. What we will also do is unmute everybody's microphones. So if you'd like to speak and ask a question, then please feel free to do so. Mark, I actually have two questions that came into me this morning. So I thought maybe we could kickstart with those. And the first one was, what difference did the pandemic make in money laundering techniques and regulations?
Well, if we start with regulations, it gave the regulators a chance to sit back and look at what was really going on. So we've seen a whole raft of new regulations, as I said, mostly on, or many of them on UBO and who's in control, but also a huge raft of legislation on regulating crypto. So we've gone from virtual asset service providers being unregulated and kind of outside the system, now to the US, the Europe, the UK, etc., the Far East, all bringing in regulations to regulate those kind of providers. In terms of money laundering, we kind of went back to, as I said, to this manual kind of thing where we were using money mules a lot. And what happened was, because a lot of financial institutions had staff working from home, it wasn't as efficient. I know people say, oh yes, it was, but it wasn't as efficient. Mm-hmm. And I think it's only over the next 6 to 8 months we're going to see where some of the problems really lay. I would say that you know, there have been people who have been setting up new schemes. I mean, I talked about horse racing and things like that, which are going to be, and football, going to be big issues over the next year.
Right. Okay. That's really interesting. Thanks so much for your perspective on that. And we do actually have somebody else that's posted a question, and they're asking, what are your views on Malta now that it's been off the grey listing hook? Yeah,
and good that it has. You know, we have a saying in English, the way you close the stable door after the horse has bolted. And because we were looking at Malta, the criminals have gone elsewhere. So it's now, you know, they've used Malta and they've now spat it out, because everybody's looking at Malta, the FATF were looking at Malta, etc. And we don't know where they're going to pop up next. There have been some indications that maybe Namibia might be somewhere that they're looking at, and also possibly Iceland. But you know, yeah, I mean, I think with Malta, it's got to rebuild its reputation. It's got to carry on doing the good things they're doing and trying to, you know, keep standards up. But it's, you know, we're better off spending money now looking elsewhere.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Fantastic. And we've got another question from Stefan Berry asking, should and will we see football clubs become subject persons?
Well, they already are under certain regulations, because you know they take so much money, and they're kind of high value dealers in that respect. I could give you an example of a very well known global club who have now appointed 2 MLROs. So they actually have a compliance department internally with MLROs, because they felt that they were very vulnerable. And that's a club you will have heard of.
Would you like to share? No, okay, that's fair enough. We do have another question as well. And what has been the relationship between cyber fraud and money laundering, and what are the measures put in place to combat that?
Well, every time a cyber fraud happens, the money has to be laundered. And of course, it will normally go to a third-party bank, and the money will then be immediately transferred, or to a bigger bank, and the money will be immediately transferred and the account closed. What is happening is that we're seeing a shrinkage of correspondent banking relationships. So a lot of the larger banks are refusing to offer CB relationships to banks that they don't trust or don't know particularly well. And that's, part of that nobody's willing to take the risk. The EBA have said, no, you don't need to do that in terms of your risk controls, but a lot of banks are just not bothering to do it. So the relationship is the money has to be laundered, and it goes into a bank account, or it goes into a cyber wallet from somewhere. And there are various ways of getting your money out. You can get your money out. I've seen it done with Rolexes. I've seen it done with gold. There are people on the dark web, and I'm not for a minute suggesting you go onto the dark web, but there are people on the dark web who act as middlemen. And what they'll do is, and this is absolutely true, they will leave the value of your Bitcoins. Let's say you have $1 million worth of Bitcoins and you want it in stamps, for example. They will leave the stamps by the third tree on the right in Regent's Park, the one with a little blue marker beside it, at Friday at 3 p.m. And as long as you're there watching them at Friday at 3:02 p.m., you pick it up and away you go. So, anything can be done like this that we never see. We never think to look for.
Sure. Okay, that's fair enough. We're actually getting a lot of questions on the chat function, so I'll try and whiz through this. So the next question is: will the EU regulations of crypto MiCA be relevant in the AML and CFT context?
Yes, they should be. I was doing a course on crypto last week, and I was saying I don't know what's going to happen now with crypto, because if I'm a member of the Sinaloa cartel and I was changing my dollars to Bitcoin at 50 and now it's worth 20, I might be a bit cheesed off. So it may put some of the big criminal gangs off using the major cryptos. They might go for the smaller ones or so-called stable coins instead. But I mean, the rules will have an impact. But of course, I see all these things come out. They say, "Oh, we know about every crypto transaction and we know what goes on." I think, no, you don't. No, you don't. That's part of the thing. You don't know. You don't. If it's an exchange on the dark web, you don't know.
And just on the subject of crypto, someone's actually asked, is cryptocurrency playing a part here also?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is. I mean, we found Mexican gangs, Colombian gangs being paid in crypto. We found money being transferred in crypto. There was a gang caught in Spain last year. There was a gang in France a couple of years ago caught. And of course, in terms of ransomware, if you're North Korea, who are rumored to make $3 billion a year out of ransomware, it's all crypto.
Right.
So
okay.
That will have to be exchanged at some point for hard currency. But again, because of the recent volatility, I'm not entirely convinced it's going to be as popular going forward as it has been.
Okay. Thank you for that. Someone's also asked, you mentioned charities as being a way of laundering. What percentage is this in comparison to other types of industries?
The answer is it's probably, somewhere 7 to 10%, something like that. And they all tend to come from 2 or 3 regions. But we also find quite long chains of laundering with a charity stuck in there somewhere. And so it's impossible to tell who's really controlling it, because it's quite an easy thing to set up a charity. And lots of people do it for perfectly legitimate reasons. And my experience of charities is that the very big charities Again, they have their MLROs and they have their compliance and all that kind of stuff. The smaller to medium-sized charities don't. And of course, the people who may be sitting in shopping malls collecting for a charity you've never heard of. And we have them go door to door here in the UK, fake charity people asking for donations, etc. And it's been a huge thing during the pandemic. So it is quite common, but I wouldn't say it's any more than 10%.
Okay. And then we just got 2 more questions as well. I'm just conscious of everybody's time. Will the terrorism model we had between 2015 and 2018 make a comeback, do you think?
Well, it depends what you mean by the terrorist model. What happened between those areas was terrorism became very cheap, very inexpensive, because you were just buying a knife. You were just hiring a truck or whatever it happens to be. So yes, I think it will stay like that, because it is very, very difficult for the banks to spot what's going on. You can't flag everyone who goes into a supermarket and buys a knife. You just can't do it. It's impossible. So I think that if that's what you mean of the inexpensive model, then yes, it will return, because it's a very efficient way of doing it.
Right. Okay. And I've got another question here. Are there any plans to create a central UN, EU, US, UK sanctions platform to make it easier for smaller firms to check, as the reality is not that everyone has the financial capabilities to subscribe to services and platforms that provide such a central list? Many of the lists online are difficult to follow with additions and changes.
There are no plans I've seen, but of course, all the regulators and the semi-regulators talk about sharing information. We've got to share information, and the first step forward is to share information and all that. Well, it's a really easy thing to do, but it's stopped by national jealousies. It's stopped by data protection laws in certain areas. It's stopped by the fact that some countries are very happy to facilitate this kind of stuff. And so, no, I haven't seen anything that would lead to that kind of sensible arrangement.
Okay, fantastic. And then last but not least, what are your views re the EU's proposed AMLA?
Yeah, my views are good luck with it. Well, I think with the EU, once they allow national wiggle room, then you have a problem. And that's not to attack the EU, it's the same everywhere. If you look at how many successful money laundering prosecutions there have been outside of the Americas, it's really very few in relation to the amount of money that's laundered and what they could be doing. So I hope and I pray that it will be good, it will have real teeth, but more importantly than that, it will be properly funded. Look at what the Americans do. They give their regulators tons of money and they incentivize them to do it. If you look at the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in America, it pays whistleblowers. Yeah, the new European Whistleblowing Act, pay people, fund it, it will work. But if you're not going to do that, then you're going to have to get lucky. So I wish it well, and I really hope it works. But I think they need to throw money at it big time.
Sure. Okay, well, thank you. That was so interesting, and really appreciate your perspective on all of those. I'm just conscious of everyone's time. So what I think we'll do is, if anybody does have any other additional questions, please just feel free to send those to me directly, and I can pass those on to Mark after the webinar, and he will be more than happy to, to help answer those as best as he can. So thank you everybody for joining. The webinar is now over. It was really lovely to have you all. I hope that we have kind of demonstrated just how critical all these subjects are at the moment, and topics for you and your organizations to be thinking about if you haven't done so already. So please do fill out the survey if you get some time. It's not going to be any longer than 2 minutes of your time. Here on your screens, you can see the QR code. That will take you straight there, or you can follow the link in the chat box as well. Your feedback is really, really important to us, so we do appreciate that. So IFF will actually be hosting more and more of these free 30-minute webinars on the latest finance topics. So again, if you are interested to receive more information on that, please do email me directly. You will all be receiving a copy of the webinar as well, just for your reference, you can refer back to, so please look out for that. So thank you all so much for joining and sharing your time with us today. Thank you, Mark, for being our subject matter expert today. And we really hope to see you all soon again on the next free webinar. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.